Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project.
And trying feeding this through the mic on the camera, because the mic on the standard mic seems to be failing. So I can now twist that away. Let me know how the sound is, because it might be a little less clear than usual. But if you can hear me fine, then let me know. But it looks like I'm going to have to finally invest in a new microphone, having had that one for 2 years. So yeah, let me know if there's more, well, any sound at all coming out. Right, okay. How are the sound levels? If you can hear fine, indicate in the chat, and we'll go with this. Though I'll clearly have to investigate what's up with the microphone. So now I look less like Howard Stern with no hair and more like somebody who's doing TV presenting. So I do miss the mic in front of me already. It makes me feel like I'm doing my own sort of Alex Jones thing. Right, so thank you to everybody who's tuned in so far. We'll get underway. So Philbin, Paul Charo, Big Meanie, Mike Martinez, Heidi Edelweiss, Austin. Good morning to Ash from the arse end of the world. Well, that depends which way you're looking at the world, though pretty much all of the imperialist countries are looking more and more like an armpit of the world at the moment. Hello to James Graham, Barry Goodman, hello to HM, and Zuleika, good evening to you, and hello to Burke and everybody else who's in the chat so far. Again, chime in if the sound's not good enough and I'll see what I can do about it. But as I said, we begin with the Artsakh crisis, and I wanted just to drop this in because I think the strategy, or such as it is, of US imperialism here and the tactics they're using are now quite clear with regard to the Armenian scenario. As covered in the interview that I did with Alison Tamizian and in the broadcast we did on this last week, it's clear that US imperialism, if we look at their own admissions published in the RAND think tank report, is purely in this to gain some kind of tactical advantage against the Russians, trying to evict them from the South Caucasus region via the manipulations they're engaging in with Armenia. And of course, there is the secondary consideration, though a very, very important one, which is to gain some kind of tactical advantage over Iran. Now, to that end, they have, of course, purchased themselves a government in the form of Pashinyan and his clique. And if you view everything that Pashinyan has done through the lens of the advance of the interests of US imperialism, then everything makes sense. Because, of course, US imperialism couldn't fully get its claws into Armenia whilst the country was still part of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which, of course, the United States very much wants to weaken. And, of course, Armenia had, at least at one stage, one of the smaller but very well trained armies in there. And also, they, in the days of the Soviet Union, Armenian military commanders and Armenian military formations played a significant, slightly outsized role in the old Soviet Red Army. So Weakening the CSTO, obviously a big goal, and of course Pashinyan has delivered upon that. Eventually, the US hopes that he will evict the Russians from the base they have in Armenia, and of course then get rid of the peacekeeping force that exists inside Nagorno-Karabakh. And if viewed in those terms, of course, everything that Pashinyan has done makes much, much more sense. It's nothing to do with the security or prosperity of Armenia, of course. It's everything to do with serving US imperialism. I'm sure Pashinyan, if you tried to have an honest conversation with him, might have his justifications, but none of them would be good. So the other side of this, of course, is the game being played by Aliyev and ultimately Erdogan. Aliyev and his primary sponsors, who are, of course, Erdogan in terms of political support, and behind him, or above him, should we say, is, of course, British imperialism. Very big investor in Azerbaijan. As we said last week, an awful lot of money being made there. And without the support of British, French, and US imperialism, Aliyev would not be able to have constructed the state that he has done. Now, the activities of the Azerbaijani government inside occupied Artsakh now, having destroyed, well, gained the complete capitulation and dissolution of the Artsakh Republic with the active connivance of Pashinyan and his clique, the Azeri authorities are now, of course, detaining people who were part of the old Artsakh government, who were part of the Artsakh Defense Forces, not just recently, but over the last 29 years since 1994, since the Republic of Artsakh was created. Now, you would think that, of course, Azerbaijan, having won this victory with the active collaboration of the Armenian government, would, for the purposes of more easily absorbing the area into Azerbaijan, could afford to engage in amnesties, could afford to just say, well, we'll wipe the slate clean. There's no grudges to be held. But of course, Aliyev can't do that because since the establishment of this, British client state, British and Turkish client state, which is essentially what Azerbaijan is, the official ideology has been based upon a rabid form of nationalism that was cooked up by the crooked late period Soviet intelligentsia and reinforced by Aliyev and his father, which is based on rabid hostility towards the Armenians, principally. So Aliyev, even if he wanted to make concessions there, couldn't do so. The founding basis of his regime is this perverted form of nationalism, which is, of course, much like all of the petty nationalisms of comprador bourgeoisies, is targeted at regional or national minorities or rival nationalities that the regime seeks to define itself against and whip up a base of support that is able to be mobilized in order to blind people to the fact that the role that the Baku regime is playing is that of essentially a sock puppet for British, Turkish, US, and French interests, which of course brings us back to Pashinyan again. So why on earth would a section of the Armenian comprador bourgeoisie think that siding with US imperialism, which already has 1,000 bargains going on with Baku, would be a good idea? And the answer is that these idiots, for reasons of open corruption or foreign influence or misguided ideas about the European Union especially, thought that they would be able to, by ditching Artsakh, be able to join these wonderful European and American-led institutions, and that would be the way to quick prosperity for at least them. Of course, they're going to be wrong because that's not the end of Aliyev and Azerbaijan's territorial claims. You go and look for video of Aliyev making threats towards the territories currently held by the Republic of Armenia as it was constituted in 1991. There's plenty of them, and it's not just talk either. Aliyev and Erdogan intend to, as we've said before, connect in a much more direct way and permanent way Nakhchivan and Azerbaijan to make one greater Azeri state. And then eventually they'll expand that link to swallow more and more areas of what's now Armenia. Now, of course, US imperialism doesn't really care about any of that. They have their deal with Aliyev, and it's been very good for them. And of course, the Israelis, US imperialism's most loyal attack dog, have their deal with Aliyev as well. He's in a position, is the ruler of Azerbaijan, because of the enormous amount of oil and gas that they have at their disposal, that they can deal with pretty much anybody. And so Armenia, through the actions of the Pashinyan clique, hasn't improved their security situation one bit, even though those but a collection of morons inside the Elysee Palace think that they're winning a great victory by opening up an extended embassy in Armenia now. Of course, Armenia already has one occupying power with a massive embassy in Yerevan, and that's the United States. Zakharova, the spokeswoman of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, revealed yesterday that the US embassy is 2,000 strong in Yerevan. Now, they don't put 2,000 people in such a small country as Armenia without a serious project in mind. And that project is, of course, to permanently win over and win control of the political, military, and intelligence networks of Armenia in order to steer it firmly under the control of the United States and evict the Russians. That's as far as their plan goes. Now, what Aliyev and Erdogan will do now is work on getting the Russians and the Iranians to agree to an eventual Azeri takeover of Armenian lands, including the border crossing into Armenia, which the Iranians are very concerned about losing, which is why you've now got Iran and even countries relatively further away, such as India, starting to make noises about strengthening their ties with Armenia, because they don't want to see this greater Ottoman-inspired pan-Turkic project go any further. So what Erdogan will do, who's the lead international negotiator for this process, because it's his big idea, will be going to Moscow and going to Tehran and saying, look, Pashinyan's inviting the US into there, even though Turkey is in NATO. Come on, you know me. I'm not going to dance to the US's tune too much. If you agree to these territorial alterations and an expansion of Azeri territory and the eventual linking up of Nakhchivan and Azerbaijan via a permanent land corridor, which is going to be seized from Armenia, then, well, isn't it better me, Erdogan, the devil you know, rather than the devil you don't in the United States? And that will be the selling point that he's taking to Tehran, and the selling point that Aliyev, I'm sure, will take up in Moscow as well. Because the more Pashinyan and his gang get close to the United States and try and desperately secure entry into the EU and NATO, the more Tehran and Moscow will turn hostile towards them. And that is exactly, of course, what Aliyev and Erdogan want. They want the biggest potential supporters of Armenian sovereignty to be alienated from Armenia. Thus, when they eventually do attempt their absorption of more Armenian territory into Azerbaijan, linking up these two areas of the Azeri state, then they can be fairly sure that there won't be the kind of objections that would be there today or would have been there 3 or 4 years ago. So Pashinyan is damning Armenia to an eventual swallowing of most of its territory by Azerbaijan, and maybe in the end the extinction of the Armenian state by relentlessly alienating it from its two most important regional allies, who could secure its territorial integrity, its sovereignty, and its independence. They're refusing to do that and are running headlong towards the fading dream of EU membership. Of course, they're never going to be allowed in the EU. No one's particularly interested in including Armenia inside of it, and they're certainly not going to be allowed in NATO. And by the way, both these institutions, especially the EU, are now ensnared in a myriad of deep contradictions, which may well finish them off for good. So Pashinyan, in pursuing this complete pipe dream, has led Armenia quite literally into a ditch. And the only way they're going to be able to get out of it is if they manage to rid themselves of Pashinyan, which is why Samantha Power, that foul ghoul, has gone over there to promise all kinds of things if Pashinyan holds firm. You've now, though, got the problem for Pashinyan, at least, that the protests did compel one change in policy in Armenia, which is that he was obliged to let the Artsakh Armenians into the country. He didn't want to do that. He was going to bar them from entry. That caused such a scandal that he had to reverse track. Now you've got 50,000 plus Artsakh Armenians inside the country already. More are probably going to follow. It's only a tiny minority who will stay in Stepanakert and the other areas of Artsakh. So it's going to be a real mess for Pashinyan, but the US and its considerable influence inside the country will do anything they can to keep him in power. And the biggest laughter will come from Ankara, because the longer Pashinyan is in power, the better a chance of this pan-Turkic federation of coming into existence, as Pashinyan tears up the alliance with the Russians, distances himself from the Iranians, until eventually Armenia is left with allies on paper in the form of the US and the French and the ever perfidious British, but none of them will come to Armenia's defense if the Azerbaijanis decide to stage another land grab, which they will at some stage. They keep promising they will. And in terms of these particular commitments, Aliyev always lives up to his promises. So that's the situation in Armenia, a tragedy caused by the utter uselessness and incapacity of the Armenian bourgeoisie to rule, their complete failure to build a state that can withstand the pressures of US imperialism, and the massive influence of a external comprador clique, comprador ruling class, I should say, in the form of many aspects of the Armenian diaspora who are resident in France and the United States especially. All of these forces have combined together to fundamentally compromise Armenian statehood, sovereignty and independence. And as I've said before, only a mobilization of the Armenian masses led by the Armenian proletariat can actually rescue this situation. The Armenian bourgeois have largely proven themselves incapable of doing anything positive now. So it is up to the Armenian working class to actually solve this situation by shutting down the country until Pashinyan is chased from power. Whether that's something which is capable of being delivered, I don't know at this stage. Further research is required. But I'll pause there, then just say hello to everybody else who's joined us in the chat. So Tusker, Ill State Fishing, and Peter, my fellow resident of Perfidious Albion, good evening to all of you. Now, moving on to the subject at hand, just pausing briefly on the way there to laugh at Justin Trudeau's non-apology and his forcing of the House of Commons Speaker to resign. Quite why they were engaging in the stunt that they pulled the other day is still open to debate. Some people think, of course, that Trudeau was seeing what he could get away with. I place the blame for this more with Chrysler Freeland, who, of course, is the power behind the Trudeau throne and is, of course, a rabid supporter of the current Ukrainian regime. And I'll go for it and say a rabid fascist. I think there's no other way to describe her. I know that she'll be described as a liberal journalist, but if somebody supports Ukrainian fascist organizations for her entire lifetime and is so paranoid about the reality of her grandfather's employment during the Hitlerite years coming out, and has been an enthusiastic and rabid anti-communist all the way through her career, and there's no other way to describe that person other than a fascist. I don't care what party that she's in or what party label that she sticks around her neck. That's somebody who you will know by their association. So I think it was her idea. I think she sold it to Trudeau by saying, Justin, this is a great idea, isn't it? And he said, yes. So it's her idea. She wanted to see if she could get away with it. She almost did. But of course, the primary credit for exposing it goes to, of course, a Ukrainian academic who now works in Canada, who we've mentioned before when it came to his work on the Maidan massacre, which is Ivan Kachinovsky. He was the one who was making this as much of an issue as it was. So huge credit has to go to him in exposing this. And of course, Trudeau now says, well, we've apologized and now we will never mention it again. And now everybody must forget that it happened. As Eval Lilienkov, the late great Soviet academician, as the Russians say, said, the best way to understand Orwell's 1984 is that it's actually written about capitalism, regardless of what the reactionary intentions of the author actually were. So let's leave that there for now. We will return, of course, to the Führer Freeland and Gruppenführer Trudeau in the future. But we now move on to the vexatious question of so-called populism. And what is it? Why should we be concerned with it? And let's start off by setting some terms here. What do we mean by populism? Of course, there is the oldest form of it, which is, of course, we go back to various forms of it that were found in ancient Greece, or can be found in terms of its origins, in terms of Caesar's appeal to the popular plebeian masses in the period of the late Roman Republic, or should we start in a more up-to-date fashion? Is it something that in its modern iteration can only be really understood with reference to the age of mass enfranchisement of the working class to form the modern day bourgeois democracies, perhaps? Should we locate its modern origins with, say, William Jennings Bryan in the United States, or later on, a certain Mr. Huey Long? Or should we look at things such as how far you can describe fascism as populism? So a lot of questions to consider here, but let's try and come up with a definition. A broad definition, first of all, that can cover populism as a trend, which of course we need to be broad because there's so many different variations of it. I would put it in the following terms in terms of understanding it in its modern iteration. It is a particular form of politics that grows up in the period after mass urbanization, and of course in these capitalist societies, it is defined by an appeal to the concept of the people or the masses or those who are outside the centers of power. And it is an appeal based on the idea that an elite that's always, well, not always, but often kept quite amorphous, that an elite has seized power and taken it away from this group that the populist defines as the people, and that this elite needs to be displaced, and that the populist politician is the one who stands outside of that elite, who is often portraying himself or herself as someone that this elite, who are often portrayed as overly educated and underemployed, that he is someone who is looked down upon by them, and thus he identifies or she identifies with you, the people, because you are all in the out group together. And I would say that is a broad definition of the populist trend from the late 19th century onwards. Now, it's difficult to give a definition that's more detailed than that without diving into individual forms of populism. Now, in terms of reference points for us in the last 100 years or so, I would say that there's a couple to look for or look at, which is you get the populism of the United States, for instance, where there was quite a number of populist trends in the late 19th century, which Thomas Frank, whose politics I have no time for whatsoever, but he's written some interesting historical things on the populist trend in late 19th century USA, which of course culminates in the presidential runs of William Jennings Bryan, farmer populism being one particular area that's quite strong. You get the populist elements then making their way into the campaigns of Theodore Roosevelt, and more specifically, finding expression in his independent campaign for the presidency with the Bull Moose Party. Later on, of course, we reach other particular areas of interest. So if we move on a few decades and look at a big inspiration for populism, particularly outside of the imperialist countries, we have the example of Juan Perón in Argentina, who is condemned as both a communist and a fascist at various different times by various different people. Now, Perón, of course, a former military officer who rises to the presidency. Now, he builds a very interesting network and support network amongst labor unions, amongst people in certain elements of the more radicalized middle class. Even he manages to appeal to certain Marxist groups to bring them into this big umbrella coalition that he has. Now, this is, of course, something which occurs quite a number of times in the development of Central and Southern American bourgeois politics. But Perón is one of the people who inspires an awful lot of these types of populist movements in South America. And of course, by building all these different elements into his coalition, he of course ultimately attracts the opposition of the ruling class and of course certain elements within the state bureaucracy, which of course is the reason for his overthrow in 1955, a brief comeback later then to be disposed of again. But the long-lasting impact of that is of course still seen in Argentine politics to this day, with the fact that so many different trends fall out of the Peronist movement, the original Peronist movement, that all three candidates for the Argentine presidency, to one extent or another, slightly less in Milay's case, but there are some right-wing Peronists supporting him, all claim some lineage from him, the father of the modern Argentine state in many different ways. Now, we bring it to the modern era, and here, of course, you have to look at populism differently when you're talking about an imperialist country or a non-imperialist country. I always found the definition of Perón as fascist to be ridiculous, considering his coalition was built on actually incorporating labor unions and even some Marxists into the support base for it. Certainly no fascist ever did that. Certainly that's not what Franco was about, or Mussolini or Hitler, or any of the military dictatorships in South America that could be described as leaning fascist or that were just pure military regimes. So there needs to be a different treatment between populism as a phenomenon in the imperialist countries and as a phenomenon in the non-imperialist countries. So you couldn't really compare, for instance, a figure who emerged as a US military officer and tried to build something similar to what Perón did in Argentina. You couldn't really find such an individual at particularly this stage in the game. Populism in the US or in Britain has often been, of course, very heavily tinged with, support for the re-establishment or the re-strengthening of US or British imperialism, which of course leads us to a discussion of populist trends adopted by establishment politicians. So you could argue that there are populist elements to Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, of course, in his first campaign and his second, campaigned specifically as a law and order candidate, but who was, and this was again a precursor to Reagan, who was portraying himself ludicrously, because he was a former vice president and long-term political animal, long-term congressman before that, but he was portraying himself as a outsider. He was somebody who was outside of the new elites. He was looked down upon by everybody, and he was with you. He was with the silent majority who were excluded from power and who were ignored by these sneering liberals and damn hippies. And he was going to bring the voice of the silent majority into power. And you could argue that that was an attempt at a populist turn from Nixon to counter the waves of radical struggles that were going on in the US at the time. He had to take a populist turn in order to counteract them properly. So that's an interesting case study. More specifically, though, you can look later on, and this is in perhaps a more developed form you get with Reagan, which is that he, or more to the point, Reagan's handlers, built a coalition based on an apparently totally contradictory bunch of elements, which is that, of course, you have an economic program which is pure class war upon the American worker, but at the same time, of course, Reagan is sold as the guy who's going to stand up against the damn bureaucrats in Washington, who's going to cut them down to size, who's going to stop the state rewarding loafers and the work shy, who's going to restore American pride following it being battered by the defeat in Vietnam. And again, drawing from Nixon, who's he's claiming to come from outside of the liberal elitist channels, and this Nixon and then Reagan set the template for so many particularly Republican politicians and presidential contenders, with the construction of the image. Again, it's based slightly in reality of the liberal elites, the leftist elites in the big coastal cities who are spending all their time laughing and sneering at the God-fearing ways of the traditional American. And of course, Reagan builds in the support from the religious right and makes this a crucial part of his coalition, thus basically planting a bomb under the Republican Party in the end, because you, on the one hand, are preaching a certain degree of social conservatism and social stability, and on the other hand, you're pursuing policies that are absolutely antithetical to that and are going to produce more and more alienation, dislocation, and negative cultural turns, which you claim to be against, but every single policy you support furthers that disintegration that, again, your religious side claims to be all about preventing. Still, this is very successful for a generation, whilst, of course, life for American workers got harder. People worked for longer for wages that were stagnating. And this is, of course, covered up by a credit boom, which, of course, we all know how that ends in 2008. Drawing very broad brushstrokes there, but this isn't primarily an economics episode, that there are elements of that will get brought in. So that Reagan's populism is, of course, designed to appeal to the discontented working class who's fallen out of love with the New Deal coalition. It should be emphasized that the New Deal had already basically disintegrated by the late 1960s in terms of the coalition that built it. The disillusioned working class vote that Reagan picks up and is able to hang on to, a lot of it is based on the idea that the New Deal is now holding back the hard worker and rewarding those who are cheating the system, and that the damn coastal elites just want to keep all these underclass types on welfare and want to destroy the inner life of the great American interior. And a similar thing can be observed with the Thatcherite populism. Again, similar thing, although she came slightly before Reagan, designed by very similar people as well, which is that you take the idea of the destruction of the tripartite state that the Labour Party had tried to build in the 60s and 70s between employers, Labour Federation, and of course the government. The idea of the post-war welfare state. And you say similar things to what Reagan is saying in the United States. You were making an appeal to the discontented working class, of which there was plenty by 1979, saying, look, this state is a bureaucratic nightmare. Your earning power is being held back by state bureaucracy, by trade unions, by all these people on unemployment insurance. unemployment benefits. We will unleash your potential. You will be able to have a direct stake in owning the country. You will be able to buy shares in the privatized utilities. The state bureaucracy and the trade unions and the communists, they all want to stop you, hard-working British individual, from getting what you want. And what you want, of course, is higher wages, but also property. You want ownership. You want to be able to have your home as your castle. The Englishman's home is his castle. You'll be able to have a castle. We'll give you a cheap mortgage. You'll be able to buy shares in British Telecom, British Gas, all the privatized utilities. All we need to do is get rid of the damn unions, and all your earning potential will be unlocked, and your ability to buy property will be boosted, and you'll be part of this great property owning democracy. And there'll be no need for those things such as collective organizations anymore. As Margaret Thatcher said, to give the full quote, there is no such thing as society, only individuals and their families. You and your family will be safe in your castle with your stock options perpetually paying into your bank account, and there'll be no need to concern yourself with anything that happens outside of the four walls. So get a credit card, get another credit card, get another credit card on top of that, take out a second mortgage, buy more shit, consume more, join the great anaesthetized society, and leave government to the experts. Now, of course, I am being a little over the top there in what I'm saying, but you are getting the picture, I hope. And of course, this is emphasized as well by the marketing of both Reagan and Thatcher as outsiders. Thatcher always claimed that, of course, she was from humble origins. She was, well, from more humble origins than many of the Conservative leaders. Her father was a grocer. She did, however, go to university and get a degree, I believe, in chemical engineering. So she wasn't exactly from coming out of the soil, shall we say, but she portrayed herself as an outsider, as somebody who was bringing these radical new ideas into the system. Of course, this is all bullshit. This is all stuff that has been cooked up in the think tanks funded by the ruling class to provide them with a weapon to be wielded against the organized working class in order to destroy their organizations and ultimately force down wages and make British capitalism more competitive, so to speak, by engaging in deindustrialization and the mass offshoring of production, and of course using more aggressive British imperialist tactics to batter down the barriers to British capital going all over the world. Now, of course, nobody wants to run on that particular picture, but you get the idea of how Thatcher was marketed. She is the outsider, coming with the ideas that are going to benefit you, the people, the amorphous mass out there that's not defined by class, but it's defined by its love of hard work and industry. So there's a couple of examples of how a populist turn is used by the ruling class. Now, one of the things that, of course, the ruling class taps into is the individualism that grows within the labor aristocracy and the petty bourgeois in the 1960s, and the division between the labor aristocracy and the great mass of the working class from the mid-60s onwards. From 45 to 65 in Britain, and I think in the United States too, you get a broad uplift of the entire working class. And this is, of course, one of the very few times in history where the entire working class actually secures a boost in income at the same time. Now, would be remiss in my duties here if I didn't, of course, point out that that bribe to the entire working class came from the increased exploitation of the colonized world. Even when the British were being kicked out of it, they were still hyper exploiting everywhere they could on the way out. Now, of course, when there is a turn towards the negative in terms of growth, and the crisis of British capitalism returns with a vengeance in the early to mid 60s, in this period of uplift of the entire working class stops. From then on, you get a relentless class warfare being waged on the great bulk of the working class, but with the labor aristocracy being slightly separated from that, and certainly a good portion of them going directly over to voting for the Tories from the mid-70s onwards, at least. This is, of course, aided by the divisions that the Labour Party helps to stoke within the working class by dividing up the unified movements that had existed prior to 1974 and making sure that there's as many different atomization measures taken through pay deals, through industrial restructuring and everything else that basically makes Thatcher's victory in 1979 all but secured, because the Labour Party's done the job of dividing the working class into atomized sections long before Thatcher comes along. But that's the necessary foreground to understanding the victories, especially of Thatcher in Britain. And we go back to our original definition here of the populist identifying themselves with the outgroup and being a member of that outgroup. So the whole question now we bring up to date with a look at populism since 2015-16. And it's worth saying that, of course, the populist trend continues in American and British politics, especially because you get a sort of semi-attempt at populism by the people who are trying to sell John Major to the British electorate, because he came from a section of the working class. He again wasn't quite like previous Tory leaders, so he was sold as a bit of an outsider. The whole turn of Tony Blair was that, again, much like the designs of the Thatcherite campaigns, it was all about the idea that he was a leader who was, again, could tap into the ambitions of the petty bourgeoisie and the Labour aristocracy, who was going to be their guy. It's very similar stuff to the Thatcherite rhetoric. But the whole marketing of politicians in the bourgeois democracies since really the 60s has been more and more focused on the idea of them as new brooms. They're outsiders. They're people who are going to come in and take on this ill-defined establishment, which no one will ever really tell you what the establishment is. It just generally means a collection of amorphous things that people don't like or can be portrayed in a negative sense. So the left and more radical right populist trend that emerges since at least the Eurozone debt crisis and the 2008 recession. This is a little bit different in that it comes from more outside of the system. And the trend has been with the reactionary side of things, like Marine Le Pen in France, Meloni in Italy, and of course the AfD in Germany, has been on the reactionary populist turn towards the attempt at reassertion of the influence and power of the nation over the amorphous supranational organizations. This is, of course, an inevitable turn given the state of things in the imperialist countries, given that the ruling classes of Germany, France, Italy, and of course Britain were all involved in a supranational project that would seek to not get rid of the nation state, but to make sure that, in the form of the EU this is, that as many decisions as possible are taken at a great distance from any potential for the working class to interrupt them. So that's why there is so much power placed into the bureaucracy of the European Union, for instance. It's in order that the ruling can be done without reference to national parliaments. And that's, of course, a quite deliberate tactic. And if you look back at things that Jean Monnet and others, who were the original intellectual architects of the European Unity project, they were very clear that this was something that was being done to counteract the recent enfranchisement of the working class. So they were clear that bear in mind, the working class in Britain doesn't get fully get the vote until 1929. That's when the last qualifications were removed on women being able to vote. Swiss women, by the way, don't get the vote till the 1970s. But as soon as full enfranchisement under the terms of bourgeois democracy is achieved in places like Britain, France, etc., there's various attempts to find ways to negate that. The European Union is one of those. And so now we get the European Union going into a deep crisis, but that deep crisis follows on from a complete implosion and near total collapse of the working class movements of the previous century. And the communist parties across Europe are either in the terrible state that the French Communist Party is, it's a completely compromised joke, to having disappeared like the Italian Communist Party did, or be fractured into about 50 different communist parties like it is in Germany, or be an adjunct of the Labour Party as it is here. So the rebellion against the shall we say, austerity measures of the European Union and other organizations comes in most cases to benefit the right, the political right, the political reactionaries, the open reactionaries. And this comes through also the frustration or the failure of left movements. So again, like, what is the tactic of like the AfD or Marine Le Pen or Meloni in Italy? Again, like, similar tactics are applied, which is to say that, first of all, people like Meloni will say some accurate things, like that the sovereignty of Italy has been compromised. Well, that's true, and it's the ruling class of Italy that compromised it quite willingly when they were seeing the benefits for themselves of being part of the supranational EU institutions. And that's why, of course, they were willing to coup out old Silvio Berlusconi in 2011, when he had some very, very mild objections to the austerity package that the EU was going to impose on Italy. You also get the talk by Meloni that the nation is being diluted. This is where you get stuff like great replacement theory come in. The nation is being diluted, and rather than, of course, talk about it in the real terms, which is that the mass migration waves coming across the Mediterranean are coming because, well, partly the nations have been ruined by imperialism. And someone like Meloni will say that every now and again, as long as she can pin it on the French. But also because the way in which the European Union countries' economies now function or don't function opens up the whole area of the nature of low-wage employment in the EU, which is growing all the time. So the waves of migration, of course, come across the Mediterranean because the demand is ever increasing for cheap labor inside the European Union countries, labor that can be employed, if you're Germany, outside of the collective agreements that are currently held to this day with the German trade union organizations, or that can work in ultra exploitable conditions in France or Spain or Britain. And of course, when it comes to the political process in these countries, the immigration question's great because the capitalist class has got people coming and going. They've got these people to uproot themselves and move out of their country of origin. And when they arrive upon the shores of Europe or upon the shores of Britain, then politicians emerge also from the bourgeoisie, or who are ultimately funded and controlled by the bourgeoisie, to divert working class anger and frustration down the dead end of racialized politics, which is, of course, what the wave of populism coming from the right does inside Europe. It's all about channeling working class and petty bourgeois anger, legitimate anger at the EU, at the institutions of Italy or France or even Germany don't seem to actually govern the country anymore, and about providing people with false answers about stopping migration, or in Meloni's case, adhering to stricter sets of Catholic values. And again, same tactics used all the time, which is that we are now the out group. The people we will rail against are partly the migrants themselves, but also the amorphous set of bureaucrats in the EU who are controlling and eroding our nation. Now, of course, this catches on because there are a set of amorphous bureaucrats in the European Union who are eroding the sovereignty of each country, but they're doing so with the full cooperation and, in fact, enthusiastic endorsement of the ruling classes of France and Germany and Italy and other places up until this point. So that's the that's the my summary of the populist trend inside the European Union. And the fact is that, of course, as Maloney is showing, excuse me, this is something which is going to go absolutely nowhere, because the whole issue which she ran on, which is I'm going to restore Italian sovereignty. Well, you can't restore Italian sovereignty without, as people like Thomas Farsi, who's a bit of a Italian enthusiast for certain forms of populism, had him on the program before. As people like him say, well, you can't restore true sovereignty without actually restoring control over the currency, which, of course, the Italian ruling class really doesn't want to do, because they've gained enormously from having access to, well, having the Italian currency be replaced by the euro. And of course, it would create a huge crisis if they tried to move off the euro now, that would negatively impact upon the Italian ruling class. So they're determined to offer Meloni the deal that, well, you don't disrupt anything that's fundamentally important to us, which involves no challenge to the euro, no challenge to Italy's status inside the EU or NATO, and we'll tolerate you making a lot of noise about immigrants and gays and reasserting Catholic values and banging on about the birth rate whilst doing nothing to actually make people want to actually bring more children to the world. And you can rule for a few years until everyone gets pissed off at you for betraying the more nationalistic aspects of your program. And the same will be true in France, where you've had, as the academic Charles de Villeneuve pointed out in his recent work, you've got the merger basically of Macron and Le Pen's programs, which is that Le Pen has abandoned all the statist aspects of her old program and has essentially adopted more and more pro-EU, slightly less pro-NATO policies, though that's coming. And Macron has moved further and further to the right in terms of doing these like ridiculous campaigns against largely Muslim religious garb, and also like campaigns around restoring France as a nation. Now, of course, with Macron, it all rings absolutely hollow, because he is a hollow man. He's not capable of doing anything to actually deliver anything other than pure rhetoric. Le Pen would end up doing something similar. She would take possibly more extreme measures over immigration and similar issues. But again, like the French ruling class right now don't see the need for any disruption to their very profitable place within the EU. And certainly they don't want any disruption with regard to their necessary alliance with US imperialism via NATO. So the populist trend on the right will inevitably peter out in its current form. Now, what we're building towards, though, is, of course, something more serious, which is that as the crisis of capitalism in the European Union, in the European Union nation states, intensifies, as the contradictions between the EU member states get worse, and particularly the contradictions between places like Poland and Germany, and also Hungary and various other nations, and the Ukraine war heads towards a brick wall of defeat for the NATO bloc, the contradictions here are only going to get worse. And so for the last 10 years, the EU has been able to weather the storm from, to a certain extent, populists on the right, but also the failed populists of Syriza on the left. Now, of course, Syriza crumbles when confronted with the opposition of the bondholders, because they, in order to resist this, would have needed to renounce their debts and essentially exit the euro and maybe even the EU itself. And that is not a fight that the likes of Alexis Tsipras were ever prepared to have. Nor was Varoufakis, even though he resigned, he wasn't prepared to engage in the kind of political warfare that would have been necessary just to keep the Greek state afloat if they'd have been dumped out of the euro and the EU. So confronted with the strong opposition of the German ruling class, and don't forget that, as Michael Hudson has pointed out correctly, behind them was, of course, the American ruling class saying to the EU, you cannot let Greece off the hook for these debts. We've got a lot of interest in debts held, but debts of various nation states all over the world. We're exposed to that. We can't have debt relief going through. You have to break the Greek government and impose all kinds of measures on them to keep them paying off this debt. And so this is one of the reasons why ultimately Cyprus cucked, because everybody stood against them, from the German ruling class to the French ruling class to the American ruling class, and he wasn't prepared to go against them and the Greek ruling class, of course. So they crumble. And of course, now you are facing a situation where the German ruling class, in particular, are going to need to revive their political system somehow. Certainly, Olaf Scholz isn't going to be cutting it. Neither is the collection of clowns in the Christian Democratic Union. Now, will they make some kind of accommodation with the AfD? It's possible, given what we're seeing now with regard to what they're doing to the AfD, talk about banning it, etc. All of these are disciplining operations which the ruling class is running on the AfD in order to get them to fall into line with the things that matter. But what about a few years down the line? If this wave of right-wing populists falls by the wayside, having got into office, faced strong ruling class opposition and ultimately crumbled, well, who comes along next? Well, with the intensification of the crisis of capitalism, we're moving more and more towards two outcomes in mind here. The other thing I wanted to mention is there is going to be another strengthening of some forms of Labour populism, left populism, will re-emerge again in the European nations and in Britain, I think. It'll be weaker than the populism that will be on the right, but it will re-emerge, and it will, more likely than not, take a harder line against the forces of the institutional left than, of course, Jeremy Corbyn was ever going to do. So there may be, when these forces start to coalesce, a slightly higher level of consciousness involved, and hopefully more workers involved, more a proletarian element to it will be needed to make any progress at all. Because you saw what happened when a supposed left populist platform, which is what some people insist on describing Corbyn as, was based upon the petty bourgeoisie. It completely imploded and collapsed. But the initial beneficiaries of this disintegration that is gathering pace within the EU is still going to be the right wing. It's still going to be the bourgeois reactionaries. So this is the thing to be aware of. They are going to be the ones who are initially strengthened, because they are the ones with the networks in place, with the support that exists within at least a minority of the ruling class for them. So they are going to be the immediate beneficiaries of the ongoing Eurozone debt crisis and the crisis of British capitalism. And so these are the things to be aware of when it comes to looking at this renewal of the populist wave that will come when the crisis of the EU intensifies. So I feel like I've spent an awful lot of time going into foreground there. So I think what we'll have to do is come back to this tomorrow. I'm aware I've now got questions in the chat, so I'll move to those before we end here tonight. Right. Hello to Lavitz. Glad you're enjoying the stream so far. Hello to Mallard over there in Slovakia. Zuleika says, hilarious that they tell you class doesn't matter while they get voice coaching lessons, as Thatcher did. Yeah, she was coached to sound less harsh on the ears of the middle classes. Blair was, of course, coached through a lifetime to not sound Scottish at all. Gordon Brown wasn't. That might be part of the reason why he was less popular with the petty bourgeoisie. Cameron did so as well. Interestingly enough, Boris Johnson, though ludicrously bourgeois himself, though more from the upper petty bourgeoisie, made a big thing of his whole Bertie Wooster act, because actually standing out from the sort of non-specific accent crowd was a bit of a vote winner for him. So he was able to use that P.G. Wodehouse style that he had to his advantage. best resource on populism, I will post some in the Telegram group tomorrow to answer Yuan's question. Thoughts on English nationalism. Mallard, it's at a complete dead end. There's been various attempts at doing this from reactionaries over the years. There's been various attempts by like right-wing social democrats to rebirth it. Complete dead end, forget about it. The best way to struggle, to build class struggle in this country is on a Britain-wide basis. English nationalism is just a parochial dead end. I would not bother to organise in that way whatsoever. Our future is in a Britain-wide class-based organising. That's the only way forward. Good afternoon to Kent in Minneapolis. Any thoughts on Moof and Ernesto Laclau? Haven't read enough of either of them to give you a firm idea. Laclau is on a long reading list I've got, but I've not got to him yet. David Green says, nevertheless, it's important, especially to non-Americans, that the interracial populist agricultural movement in the US in the late 1800s had genuine potential. That's a good point. It's something that that David's raising there. It merits probably more of a detailed examination than I've had time to do here. Socialist here, says Rix. Well, socialist back at you. Good man. Or woman. Who knows? Tusker asks, I would love to hear your opinion on MMT. I think it sounds like magical thinking, but the US left squawks about it all the time as the answer to all our problems. Well, I think it's a joke. It's much more of it's Keynesianism for dummies, basically. What I'll do is I will do two things. I will drop you an article into the chat here, which is a very good critique of MMT written by Harpal Bra, which I would recommend that anybody read. So I'll drop that into the chat. And we'll do a program on MMT when I get back online the week after next. I think we can go into it then. Ash said it would be great to hear your take on the Hollywood writers' strike that just ended. Right, I'll make a note of that. I haven't caught up with the ending of that strike yet, so I will look into it and then we'll talk about it when I've researched it properly. Ash says further, Julia Gillard in Australia also changed her accent. Don't think it was a big deal in Australian Labour and Liberals claim to stand with the battlers until I saw that. Yeah. Did she change it to what? Sound more neutral? I mean, I can't remember what Gillard sounds like, but was Gillard changing her accent to sound what? Less working class, more working class? Be interesting to hear what she was trying to do with that. Paul Charo, thanks for the donation there. Great to see all your hard work with plenty of live streams to teach us from an ML perspective to a generally engaged, informed, and intelligent group. Thank you. Well, we live to serve, Paul. We live to serve. Yes, well, Tusker, I hope you enjoy the article. I think it's a very good Marxist critique of MMT. Rix confirms that he is a man. Good man. Paul says, at the time I thought Gillard was doing some good things, but completely selling out Assange woke me up. Yeah, didn't it go from Rudd to Gillard and back to Rudd again? Then they lost to that idiot Tony Abbott. Yeah, very inspiring bunch. Ash says the accent was neutral and robotic. They had to remove her working class accent. By the way, battlers is Aussie slang for underdog or working class who persevere. Yeah, wasn't that John Howard's thing that he was claiming that he was for the, again, like similar to Thatcher, that he was for the battlers, so to speak, and against the loafers. It's a similar thing that Reagan and Thatcher did. And all the, like, you get like Ted Cruz and people like that doing it now. Reagan and Thatcher basically wrote the blueprint for this shit. So, right, coming up to the hour now, and I need to knock it on the head because I've got an early start tomorrow. We've got some ideas for future streams on MMT and late 19th century American farmer populism. So that's stuff to note down in the future. So I will say thank you to everybody who's contributed to the discussion tonight. I will need to get a new microphone at some stage because I feel bereft now without one. But it seems that the sound has held up pretty much okay. Right, thanks to Ash, Paul, Rix, Tusker. Thanks to Paul for the super chat contribution. David Green, Burke, Kent, Mallard, Uwan, Zalaika, Lavitz, Ill State Fishing, Peter, Heidi, Philbin, Mike Martinez, James Graham, Austin, and Philbin. So thank you to everybody for tuning in tonight. I'll be back again with you tomorrow. Be sure to like and share the stream. And also be sure to go on over to the Patreon and check that out if you haven't done so already. But until tomorrow, thank you for watching, and I'll be back to you again very soon.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kick them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortune he has seen, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land.